We cannot rely as extensively as we have in the past with respect to overseas countries, including China. It still has to be held accountable. So maybe, this is a maybe the corporate tax rate of 21% should be lowered by 50% to about 10.5% for corporations who are coming back home. Maybe that's something to look at.
Maybe. White House has floated several corporate-friendly proposals to slow the current economic crisis during a payroll tax cut, and as you all heard, an incentive to possibly bring jobs and money back home.
Conversations around how to address U.S. dependence on China are also happening in the legislative branch, as the Washington Post White House economics reporter Jeffrey Stein noted in a recent article. Senators Hawley, Rubio, Warren, and Murphy have all supported measures to make supply chains more domestic. Jeffrey joins us now via Skype to expand on this and other things. Great to see you, sir.
Good to see you, Jeff.
Thanks for having me back on.
Of course. So just bring us up to date with what the White House is thinking about in terms of an economic response, if they're even really planning a major economic response moving forward.
So we heard a couple weeks ago that the deputy secretaries across more than a dozen federal agencies, Treasury, State, DOD, were meeting to hash out what could the U.S. response to China possibly be. And a lot of the reaction to this has consisted of eye-rolling and suggesting that any attempts to get China to foot the bill for the damage caused by coronavirus is a little bit like saying Mexico is going to pay for the wall. It may sound good on the campaign trail, but it's kind of hard to imagine how they're going to do it. But this is something that I think is a little bit more realistic than some of the ideas we initially heard as being floated for responding to China. And in particular, these ideas of forcing or requiring or incentivizing American companies to bring their supply chains back to the U.S. could have bipartisan appeal. Democrats have also been calling for much more aggressive action on getting American manufacturers to bring jobs back. But the question is how, and a lot of people are very skeptical of what the White House is floating. I think Sam Hammond, who's at the Niskanen Center, had a great quote in the story. He said, "This is a little like trying to graft supply-side Reaganism onto conservative nationalism." So it's the idea of tax cuts and supply-side economics applied to Chinese adversarial economic policy, and it's not clear if that would really work.
I think that's a great quote. Sam is a friend of mine as well. It's very well said. So, I mean, Jeff, what are some of the options that would address this, but which have not been included in the White House bill? What are some, see these conservative nationalists, some of them are friends of mine. What are they saying in response to something like this corporate tax cut? And in lieu of, what are they proposing?
Well, Peter Navarro, who is probably the leader of the conservative economic nationalism movement, a White House economic official himself, has drafted an executive order that would require federal agencies over time to buy supplies that were made in the U.S. And that order, we reported earlier this month, has been sitting on President Trump's desk for weeks. And it's kind of interesting, right? Because Trump says that he's the toughest on China that there's ever been. Everyone else was completely soft and a fraud on China, and he's going to take China on. But that measure, which would basically establish a base of demand, of market demand for U.S. produced PPE and other critical supplies, has languished because other people close to the president, including Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, have warned that China could retaliate by cutting off the existing PPE supply coming into the country. And then you have sort of a fascinating, I think, sort of catch-22, because what Mnuchin and others have said is, we can't take these measures to confront China because that will lead China to retaliate. By doing that, they're sort of affirming the thesis that we are too dependent on China, that they can cut us off whenever they want. So it's a real pickle, but I understand that the president and some of his advisors don't want to completely risk the medical response. If they do this and China restricts PPE sales to the U.S., that could hurt thousands of medical personnel across the country. So it's a tough issue. I mean, I think Josh Hawley's idea is a really interesting one that I think will likely have bipartisan support. This idea of low or zero interest loans, it probably would do more than the tax cut to incentivize firms to come back. But that too could be retaliated against by China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, they love in all times, doesn't matter what, the answer is always a corporate tax cut, isn't it, Jeff? Where is Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans, not only on this piece in terms of bringing supply lines back, but where are they in terms of thinking of an economic response, especially after the HEROES Act passed on Friday?
So that's a good question. My understanding is that Senate Republican leadership, and I'm not sure if this is McConnell or someone close to him, but they're beginning to see what kind of consensus they can build within the Senate Republican caucus for some measure, some action on China. There are very intense rifts within the Republican Party between someone like Rick Scott, who wants very aggressive action on China, and someone like Pat Toomey, who's more of a free market conservative and less likely to support sort of aggressive national action to combat China. On the broader question of the aid package, McConnell came out quite quickly after the last package passed and said, we will not do bailouts for states. I think his position and the position of the Republican caucus has sort of softened since then. And we've been hearing a lot that Republican political advisors are warning that they really can't be holding the bag if Michigan has to lay off thousands of firefighters and cops, if Detroit is laying off thousands of firefighters and cops ahead of a November election. That is just too great of a political risk for Trump. And so I imagine at some point the Republicans are going to have to cave on their opposition to state aid. The Governors Association is calling for at least $500 billion. Pelosi's bill has $1 trillion. We'll see if Republicans can get that number lower, but it seems like they're not going to be able to resist that. And we're also going to probably need more money for the small business program, which could run out in the next few weeks again.
Right. So, Jeff, I mean, I think you had a tweet on Friday. You were like, all said and done, this is what I think it's going to look like. Could you lay that out for us?
Yeah, that was a bit of a guess, and hope not too irresponsible in the eyes of my editor. I think the way I see this working out is we'll get some sort of substantial tax cut for the Republicans that they'll be able to say to their party, to their constituents, and to the conservative groups, look, we got something major. And in exchange, they'll provide state aid, maybe more money for hospitals, maybe more money for frontline workers, maybe a second stimulus check, although I think that's pretty unlikely at this point, maybe a little bit more money for Medicaid, but very, very, very fall short of what Pelosi's bill has, just $3 trillion for tons and tons of stuff. None of that is really likely to be approved except for the state aid and maybe one or two other things that Democrats decide are must-pass items. So I think the sticking point is going to be this liability waiver. Republicans and the White House have been seeking a liability shield to protect firms if workers or customers get sick when visiting those stores. Can they protect the employers from lawsuits? I've sort of heard that even though this is what Republicans say is a red line demand, that they may fall back to a position of just sort of requiring guidance, something short of a law that gives these businesses legal immunity, because I can't imagine Pelosi goes along with that. But she probably will agree to a major tax cut. Democrats have already agreed to substantial tax cuts as part of the last packages.
Yeah. And
well said.
Last week there was, some noises made by Pramila Jayapal, Mark Pocan, a few of the progressives. They were opposed to, or they maybe were opposed to the HEROES Act. They didn't like the corporate lobbyist bailout. They didn't feel it went far enough. Didn't include Pramila Jayapal's idea, which is supported by actually a lot of Democrats and some Republicans, of effectively nationalizing small business payrolls instead of the program that we've had so far. Ultimately, they were not able to put up enough votes to be able to stop that bill from coming to the floor. What did you make of that whole dynamic and what it means for progressives moving forward?
Honestly, I thought it was a little confusing. Jayapal and the other members of the CPC, with the exception of Ocasio-Cortez, voted for the package that passed last month that included money for small businesses, some money for hospitals, but left out a ton of the stuff that was in Pelosi's bill. And then Jayapal voted against the bill that had money for first responders, OSHA protections for frontline nurses and other hospital workers, tons of money for housing, for renters. I know Jayapal appeared to be upset about her bill, the Paycheck Security Act, I'm forgetting the exact name.
Yes.
The nationalizing the small business front. She was upset that that wasn't in the bill, and I can understand that, but it's not really clear if that effort comes too late at this point. It's been months since these layoffs started, and her bill reflects efforts that were implemented in other European countries months ago to freeze the economy in place and prevent businesses from laying people off. But we're sort of past that point in the U.S. Yeah. The unemployment rate is already close to 20%. And then she voted against the bill that has a lot of progressive demand. So, and not only that, but she failed to bring many votes with her. So it didn't seem like a very successful show of force if that was the intent. So we'll have to see if Pelosi feels compelled to listen to her in the next package. I can't imagine she will.
Seems unlikely. Jeffrey, great reporting. Yep. Thank you so much. We love having you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Love being on. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Appreciate it, man. Next on Rising, Stacey Abrams. She's been making the case for weeks that she should be Biden's vice president. And Zed Jelani explores her record and the media's when Rising continues.